Elementor is an amazing tool for building websites, and the sheer abundance of excellent third-party plugins, the interface can quickly become an overwhelming mass of icons and widgets. In this video today, I'm going to be looking at 2 plugins that help create a more usable interface. Now, in addition to that, later on in the video, I'll be covering some extra tools in the Designer Power Up for Elementor plugin that can help you with your creativity. So be sure to stick around to see those super useful extras. Okay, so let's cut the yapping and just jump over into Elementor. So the first tool we're going to take a look at is Flexible Elementor Panel. Now, I've taken a look at this, I believe, quite some time ago in a dedicated video, but today we're going to be taking a look at the most up-to-date version because I think there's a few things have changed inside here that have just sort of streamlined it, so it's great to see that it's still in active development. Now, what exactly does it do? It just gives you a more flexible way of working with the widget panel inside Elementor when you're working with any page. So I've gone ahead and installed this, so we're ready to take a look. So firing up Elementor, you should already be able to see a difference on the left-hand side. The icons are slightly smaller, and we've also got a lot more icons per row. This just makes the whole process of working a lot easier, especially where, like me in this example, I've got a couple of plugins installed, including Elementor Pro and some WooCommerce plugins and things. And as you can see, I've got a lot of different icons available to me. So it already becomes, pretty unwieldy. Now, I know that you can use the search at the top, but that can sometimes be a little bit hit or miss, especially if you don't know the name of the plugin, or sorry, the widget that you're actually looking for. So I just like the fact that we now have a much more streamlined way of working. And if we open this out, especially if you are working with a higher resolution, larger monitor, even though you can't see it, I actually generally tend to use a 32-inch 4K monitor, or I use an ultra-wide 34-inch monitor, which gives me a lot more resolution to play about with. So having just 2 icons per row is a little bit, it's not using the space most effectively. So this gives me more control over that. So it's great to see that I can easily have more icons per row. And as you can see, I can shrink this down to its normal original size, but I've still got 3 icons per row. The other thing I can do, instead of having to go through the really annoying process of clicking to close all these panels down, which is the big bugbear I had yesterday, I can simply right click over the name of any of these panels and all of the panels immediately close up. I can right click again and all those panels will open back up. So a super quick way of being able to close all these panels down and open up just the panel that you're interested in. So I already like that fact. That already makes the whole process of hiding everything and getting access to just what I want, and also seeing what plugins I've got installed. Just super simple way of working on this. So I really like that kind of feature set. Next up, we can close this down if we want to. We can minimize it by using this arrow. So you can see this now gives us full screen. We still keep the left-hand panel on screen. We just don't have it taking up a ton of real estate. So this is perfect if you're using a smaller monitor or you just want to take some of that clutter out of the way to see things a little better in your design. Now, I know this is kind of similar to hitting this little hide panel arrow, which completely hides the panel. So you have options. That's always a good thing. We can also undock this if we want to. We can drag this off and we can position it anywhere on our screen. So if we want to move this out of our way so we can see something, especially again, like I say, if you're working with higher resolution and you'd like to be able to just move this panel around to make it a little bit more user-friendly, you can do just that. While it's floating, if you want, you can sort of magnetically snap this to any sort of side on the screen. You can see it'll snap to the bottom of the screen, the top of the screen, the left-hand side, the right-hand side, wherever you kind of want. You can position this. You can then resize this if you want to with the bottom right-hand side. You should be able to see there's a little sort of reddish-purple indicator in the bottom right-hand side. We can use that to resize this if we want to. So we can easily resize things, bring it over, snap it in place. You have a lot of flexibility with it, which is just super cool to see. We can just click to put it back into its normal location then on the left-hand side. So really easy, really intuitive. We have a couple more options that we have access to. If we come into the options for our FEP settings, we can click on there and we can choose to enable various different things. So if we didn't want this to be draggable, we can disable it. You can use the flex grid for widgets, which allows us, like I say, to have a flexible layout for all of our different widgets on the screen. You can minimize all categories with right click, which is what you've just seen I've done. And again, you can enable or disable these features. We can change the editor skin over, so if you wanted to change this to a dark pink color with a darker gray, dark orange, or you can go back to the default. Up to you how you want to work. You can see we've also got things like display the vertical collapse icon in the header panel and also display the reset panel icon in the header panel. So these are just the things you can see at the top. If you want to remove those because they're distracting and you're never going to use them, you can disable those just a couple of clicks. Super simple. Exit button options. Now we haven't taken a look at the exit button, but this kind of powers it up. Normally the exit button will just literally take you back out of the editor, back into the page that you are currently editing outside of Elementor. Now that may not always be the case. You may not want to do that. You can see the default action though is to exit and open up in view mode. In other words, you open up a new tab and you are viewing the page that you're currently editing in a normal browser window. But you can change that to any of these 5 different options. So we can jump over to view it. We can take a look at edition. We can take a look at list page or post. So it'll jump us straight back out to the list of posts or pages depending upon what we're working with. You can go directly to the admin dashboard, or you can go directly to the Elementor library, or you can just completely disable it. By disabling it, we remove it from below and we can just carry on and use it as we saw fit before. So let's just switch that back on. You also have the option then to open it in a new tab. So depending upon what you choose here, you can specify whether that opens up in its own dedicated tab, leaving the editor open in the background, which can be useful in many different cases. Or you can just say you just want to open it in the same tab and then you'll just open up wherever you go to in the same tab as you're currently working in. Again, all enabled or disabled with a flick of a switch. Responsive options. Now you can see there's a little warning at the top that tells you that these options give you control over how responsive hidden elements appear and behave inside the Elementor editor for each responsive view. Now if you're not sure what this means is, you can set up responsive options though that a certain element may show or hide depending upon the view space that's being used, the viewport, whether it could be, you're looking at a desktop, you're looking on a mobile or a tablet. Well, this allows you then to control how those are displayed on the screen. Currently, all that happens is they stay on screen and they may have a visual indicator to say that they are going to be shown or hidden depending upon different views. This gives you more control. So you can totally hide that responsive element if you want to. You can enable this. And that's something that I know a lot of people were complaining about when this initially kind of came out as part of Elementor and Elementor Pro, was that it was kind of distracting, the fact that those hidden elements still stayed on screen. Well, now you can use this plugin to hide those things. So you have a range of options available that are toggleable, so you can turn those on and off. So if you do find that you hide something and then you forget you've hidden it and you can't find it anywhere, you may want to come in to check the FEP settings and enable or disable this to show anything that you may have hidden and not realize that you're using that feature. So you can use these and you can see we've got hide responsive elements, allow editing inside hidden sections, disable responsive overlays and so on. So you can take a look through there and you can see the information that's related to it and find out what each one of these switches actually does when it comes down to the responsive options. Next up, we've got some options for the accordion widget. Now this is a very simple section and all it does is say that the first tab is closed by default but only inside the editor. You're not going to see this on the front end of the site, so you may find this useful, you may not find it useful. And then finally we have the tools and information. Inside here, all you really have is the ability to reset the panel position and size. So if you've made some changes, you could quickly jump into these settings, hit these reset, and everything goes back to its default. But what's interesting is to see that they are currently developing a pro version of this plugin. At the time of recording this, there is no pro version available. It is still in development. But if you're seeing this later down the line, you may find that that pro version has been released. So when that comes out, I will definitely be taking a look at what features that brings to the table and how that enhances on top of what the free version already gives us, which does make the Elementor editor interface considerably more intuitive to work with. I'd still like to see some further optimization options, and hopefully these are things that will come in the pro version. So I'm not going to say too much about those things right now. But this is what I wanted to just quickly demonstrate. I think it's one of those little plugins that improves your productivity when working with Elementor and Elementor Pro, and I can definitely see myself installing this on pretty much all the sites I work with while developing them. I may disable it after I've finished working on it, so then I can hand it off to the client without another plugin being installed. But when you're developing, it is quite nice to have these extra options to make the whole process just a little easier to work, especially when you've got quite a few different plugins that add a lot more icons into the Elementor editor panel on the left-hand side, or the right-hand side if you're using this, of your screen. Now that we've seen how to make the user interface of Elementor a little less overwhelming, it's time to turn our attention to the second plugin in today's video, Designer Power Up for Elementor. So let's just take a look at that now and see what this brings to the table. So Designer Power Up for Elementor gives us a ton of extra features, productivity tools, things like that, extra features, extra things you can do inside the Elementor editor itself. And I think this is another one of those things that improves your productivity by making certain aspects much more visual, giving you extra features to get more creative, and also just some things that make the whole process of doing, simple things like overlapping sections considerably easier. So I'm going to take you through some of the things you can do with this. If you'd like to see a full dedicated tutorial to this where I cover in a lot more detail all the different key functions, let me know in the comment section below. And if enough people are interested, I'll take a look at doing that. But this video should give you a good overview of what this brings to the table and whether you think is something you'd like to take a look at in more detail. Okay, so this is the plugin. If we scroll down, we can see that we've already got some well-known names like Verdi, we'll know Mick, these different people that are prevalent inside the Elementor workspace, Mick Villa. So it's good to see that they've already got some endorsements from these notable people over on the Elementor Facebook group and so on. So I'm kind of interested to see what this does. I've taken a quick look at it. This is realistically a first impression for a big part for me. But let's take a look at some of the things that we can do inside here, some of the things it brings to the table. So we can create random blob shapes, which, is very in with the design side of things at the moment. Blobs are one of those features alongside the very simplistic illustrations that are being used with some animations and so on, the Lottie animation. So good to see that you can do this directly inside Elementor itself, where you're not reliant upon some third-party SVG creation tool. Obviously, you could still use something like Illustrator, or Affinity Designer, for example, to create your own SVG and output those. But having it directly inside the editor is quite useful. Scroll down a little further, you can see we've got things like transform elements, so we can move, rotate, skew, give 3D perspective and so on. Add multiple shadow layers, so if you want to create that more realistic highlight on one side and drop shadow on the other effect to give your items a pseudo 3D look, you could do it inside here. Creative advanced gradients, control column order, nudge input values, add filter effects, apply transitions to states and so on. So there's a lot of different things you can do inside here. So let's jump over into a test page and let's take a look at some of the things we can do. Okay, so what I'm going to do first of all is show you what I think is very, very useful. And if you ever come from a sort of like a platform like Divi, or you've used some of the mock-up tools like XD and so on, or even a tool like Webflow, you've probably become used to the fact you can easily and visually edit the margins, the padding and so on for any element on your page. Well, we can do that with this plugin as well. So let's just create a new section. We're going to create a 3-column section. And you can see now when I come over to the spacing in between, I start to get these arrows. So I can now adjust things and you'll see we get this gray box with this value of 92 and a letter of S. So if we jump over into the advanced section, you can see what this is doing is adding padding to this particular section. So we're dealing with a section, so the S relates to a section. And as you can see, as I adjust this, we'll see the values change inside here. Now what's really intelligent and intuitive about this is by default it works with pixel values. So if you're not changing this to something like M's, Rems, percentages and so on, it will default back to pixels. However, you can use other values. You're not reliant upon pixel values. You can use pixels, M's, percentages, Rems, whatever value is being used. You can also use different shortcuts as well. So again, if you're coming from a tool like Webflow, you'll know yourself that you can adjust all margins, all padding, all spacing and so on at the same time. So let's just say, for example, we wanted to adjust this. We could hold down the Shift key and then we could adjust this and you can see all related spacing will adjust accordingly. If we come up to here, you can see now we get both the left-hand side, right-hand side, top and bottom, all moving equally. So it's pretty cool, you can see that. There's a ton of different shortcuts you can use on here as well. So you can use things like, say, Shift to change everything together. So we could come over to, for example, this section and we could adjust that. and you see everything is adjusting accordingly inside that particular column. You know, we can also do things like we can use the Alt or Option key while dragging a spacer to change the opposite sides together. So again, all we need to do is come over to either the left or right hand side, hold the Alt or Option key down, and you can see we can adjust the left and right hand sides, and we can do the same then with the top and the bottom. You can see, super simple, just using different keyboard shortcuts. So there are a ton of keyboard shortcuts you can use. The nice thing is, if you have the advanced palette open, you can fine tune anything. So you could use this to quickly visually set what you want, and then if you needed to fine tune it to round it off, then you could just come to the advanced palette and you can see your padding, your margins for any of the elements are all editable directly inside here as well. You'll also notice we have an extra tab now once we have this Power-Ups plugin installed. Click on there and you can see we have a ton of different options. And we're going to come back and take a look at some of those as we go through this video. But let's take a quick look now, like I say, more to do with the visual aids that we've got to make the whole process of designing things just a little easier. But what else do we have that aids in the ability to create our layouts to visually lay things out? Well, how about we use a responsive grid? Now, if you've ever used a grid when you're designing things, especially if you use some of those CSS frameworks, you've probably got used to working inside the grid layout. When you work with Elementor, you don't have a visual grid to work with, and this can be very useful for a lot of people, especially if you come from that background. Well, we've got that using this plugin. So we can come down to the settings option in the bottom left-hand corner, click on there, and we're going to make sure we're in the page settings option. And from there, we can just choose to have style, and we can enable or disable the layout grid. We could use the keyboard shortcut of Command or Control and G. So we could do that just by pressing that keyboard combination, or we can use the grid toggle. So we can enable that. And once we enable it, you can see it gives us some options for how we want to work with this. You know, the size of the screen we're working with, any offset, the number of columns, 12 being the general option when you're working with these frameworks. But if you wanted to set this to something different, and if you come from a sort of print background, working to a grid is something that can be very comfortable and something you just become used to. So as you can see, we can choose the max width, which is going to be our content width. So you may have your header and your footer may fall outside of this, but you may want to keep your content inside that kind of limited size. Well, you could do that inside here, and you can set that max width up. If you want to use an offset, this is spaced at both the top, the left and right hand side of the grid. So you can see we can pull this in and out if we want to add some extra spacing in there. And again, we can use pixel values, M values, or percentage values. We can adjust the number of columns, so 12 being the typical, but some may use 15. And you can easily just change that to whatever value you want. And you can also adjust the gutter, which is just the space in between each one of those columns. And finally, you can adjust the color that's going to be used. So obviously, if you were using this kind of pale blue as part of your design aesthetic, you may want to change this to something like green. You may want to change it to a different green. You might want to go gray. You can adjust the opacity of this. So you can make it as faint as you want to, so you just have a hint of it being there and use that as a visual guide. So it's pretty cool to see we've got that extra option inside there. And like I say, if you are used to working inside that grid layout, this could be something that's a real welcome addition to, just working and designing and laying things out. Now, the next nice little productivity thing is something that you may not use all the time, but it could be something that you find quite useful. If you are fine-tuning things, you'll know yourself, using the up and down arrows, you effectively just go up or down one number at a time, so 16, 17, 18, and so on. That's okay if you want to nudge things in a very small increment. But if you want to go larger, when you're using this plugin, you can simply hold the Shift key down and put your mouse anywhere inside, and then you can use the up or down arrows and it will increase that 10 at a time. So a super quick way of being able to jump in 10 pixel increments just by using that option. So Shift up or down arrow and you'll jump up at 10 units per time. So again, just one of those little things that can be a real time saver for those of us that are more accustomed to quickly working with keyboard shortcuts that don't necessarily want to rely on a mouse to do everything. Pretty cool. I quite like that option. Now, the final sort of productivity aspect we're going to take a look at before we move on to some of the more creative ways of working with this plugin is the option to adjust the column order. Now, there are going to be times where you may want to put a design together where you've got multiple columns and then you want to change the order of those when it comes to looking at a different device. Could be a desktop, could be a mobile, could be a tablet. Let's take this example that I have on screen. As you can see, we've got 3 columns. If we switch this over now to responsive mode and we jump into mobile view, we now get those columns stacked on top of each other. So we start off with exactly the same order. That may not always be what you want. There may be cases where you want to put these into different orders. Now, all you need to do is select the actual column that you want. Doesn't matter which one of these, just have to select the column. Once you've selected the column, you'll see on the left-hand side under the layout section, you have designer power up, column order. Now this starts off at 0, so even though that's the first one, it wouldn't be numbered 1, it would be numbered 0. So we'd have 0, 1, and 2 for this 3-column layout. So let's just say I want to put this at the end. So we want this to be in this position. I can just set that to be 2, and you can see that now immediately goes to the end. But the nice thing with this is that each of your different views, each of your different breakpoints are independent of the others. So what do I mean by that? Well, you can see we've just changed the order of this. We've got this particular one now. Instead of it being 0, the first one, it's the third one. However, if we jump back to tablet, you can see they go back into their original order. So it jumps back to its 0 position. Same with desktop, back to its 0 position, back to mobile, goes into the last position. So it gives you some creative uses for this. And if you want to control exactly what order your different columns are going to be displayed in, you now have full control over that just by using this very simple power up. And that kind of ticks off the more productivity based tools that you have. Let's take a look now at some of the more creative things and how we can use those. Now, this is the area that I'm only going to give you a brief overview of these different features because there's a lot of options available and you can get quite creative with some of these, but you should have a good indication of what these do just by taking a look at this introduction. And like I said earlier on in this video, if you'd like to see more with this and maybe even see a full tutorial where I use a lot of these to create, for example, a landing page or something like that, let me know in the comment section and I'll take a look if enough people are interested in creating something that really shows some of the power you have inside this and how you could use it to create a fully fledged kind of design for a page or maybe a couple of pages. Let me know. Anyway, so let's take a look now at the first of the more design orientated features. Okay, so I pulled in a design that's just one of the template designs, and let's just say we want to do what we normally expect to do with designs like this. We want to add some kind of shape divider at the bottom of our featured hero image at the top. Well, went into the shape divider options and everything looks the same as normal. However, we now have a bucket load of extra options available. If, like me, you kind of feel like once you see one of these being used on anybody's site, you immediately know it was built in Elementor, and that just kind of says, well, you know, it just screams, I'm just using the default options. Well, now it's nice to see that we have at least some more options to choose from that are not that default. So things like this arrowhead, which creates quite a funky effect. Again, we have all the normal options, so we can change the color of this. So we could say we wanted those to be white, for example, and you wanted to adjust the width on those to create quite a cool looking effect. You can adjust the opacity on this. So let's just go back to black and we'll adjust the opacity so we get this kind of creative effect. It doesn't look great on this particular example, but it shows you how easy it is to quickly apply something, and at least it gives you some more creative options. We could bring it to the front so it sits on top of any of those elements. It's kind of brought right to the front over all of the background elements. We've got some other options, so let's just take a look at some of these other ones. Let's say we've got DP Swerve. Okay, so we've got quite a funky swirly effect on there. And again, we can do things like we can flip this if we want to have it a different way. We can adjust the width. We can adjust the height, so we can make this more or less noticeable. You can change the color on that, so we can say we want that to be white, and you can see that now interacts with the background effect. There's a ton of options. We've got a lot of different options inside here that we can use. So teeth, for example. Maybe this isn't the best example of it. So let's come down and take a look at something like this solid color where we may be able to see these a little better. So we'll come back into our style option, back into our shape divider, come to the bottom of this, and let's just take a look at some of these. So DP Paint. You get this kind of dripping paint effect. So again, we can change the color on this. So we can say we want to set that to white. So you can see now that just gives us the ability to have that background effect. We can adjust the height on there. We can adjust the width on there. You got a bit of creativity, so you can at least get stuck in and try some different options to create something that just looks a little more unique. So good to see that. Not something that I tend to use very often in my own designs, but I know a lot of people are really partial to these kinds of things. So at least you have some additional options you can play around with. Next up, let's take a look at, like I said earlier on in this video, one of those common things that people seem to like these days, and that's the blob effect. So let's just add a new section in, and all we're going to do is just use that for the basis. So we're going to come back over to our widgets on the left hand side, and we're going to do a search for blob. And there we go, there's our blob generator, so we can drag and drop that into our design. Now there's a little note at the top that says, if you want to use this as a background element, you need to set this to be inline and absolute positioning. So let me just show you what they're talking about there. Come to the Advanced tab and come down to Positioning. From there, we can set the width to be inline. So that now becomes an inline element. And we can now set the position, and we can say absolute. And what that realistically means is we can just literally drag and drop that anywhere we want inside our design. And we can use that as a background element. So it's quite cool, it's quite useful, and if you want to use it in that way, you can do. But we're going to just take a look at the options that are available for it for now, without worrying too much about setting the positioning side of things. I'm going to put this all back to the default values, just so we can see the options that are available. Come back over into our content. We can adjust the size of this. We can adjust the path points. Now, when you change the path points, you are going to have to regenerate the blob. So click on that, you can see now we get a new blob. Adjust the randomness. Click Generate Blob. So you can keep on going until you find something that you quite like. So nothing that you haven't already seen with some of the online blob generators. It's just doing it directly inside the Elementor editor itself. What I do like though is when we come up to style, we're not restricted to only using a color option. We can, if we want to, come in and choose an image. So you could use this as a sort of mask to apply to an image and then get a little bit more creative. Click on image, and then you can see that puts the placeholder image in the background. So all we need to do now is choose the image we want to use. So we'll choose this first one, insert that, change the quality so it's a little better. And you can see now we've got a nice, quite funky looking design. You know, we can come back out of this and we can regenerate the blob. We can say we want to make this bigger. We want to adjust the path points to have a few less, and we'll reduce the randomness down. Click this a couple of times. There we go. I quite like the look of that one. You may need to come back in and adjust the image and control that. And you can also specify the size fit. So you can see it says shrink to fit, or you can drop a custom size in there if you want to. So we'll just leave that shrink to fit. And we'll leave that as it is. So it's a super simple way of working. And if you want to use these blobs in your designs, you have some options. And on top of the image and the solid color, you can also simply choose a gradient. And as we know, gradients are most definitely in fashion at the moment when it comes to design. So you have that option as part of your blobs as well. So you can combine all these to get quite creative. And as always, you can adjust the location of the colors that are being used. You can adjust the opacity of the colors that are being used if you want to. You can adjust the angle, the type, whether it's linear or radial. So get as creative as you want to with not only the way you set things up, but also the content that's used inside it and the positioning that's going to be used within your design structure. So quite a nice little addition, and something I'm sure a lot of people will find very useful. Now next up, we've got another option that allows you to get a bit more creative by using gradients. And as like I say, as we know, gradients are most definitely something that are really quite in fashion in design at the moment. So what I'm going to show you is more a case of a really ugly looking kind of setup, but don't let that put you off. It's more a case of how you could use this and how easy it is to use it, and then you can get creative with the color schemes, the gradients and the effects that you want to create. So what we're going to do is we're going to select this section, and from the power ups option on the left hand side, inside there you can see we've got multicolored gradient. We can apply this to a child element if we want to, so you can select that and you can choose the child selector you want to use. I'm not going to worry about that. I'm going to keep it really super simple and apply the gradient to the background. However, you can also apply it to text. If you want to create a nice gradient effect on your text, well, you could do that using exactly the same techniques. The thing that is useful about this, though, is the fact that you can create multicolored gradients. You're not limited to just two. You can add as many as you want in this, so you could create some quite interesting effects if you wanted to. So it's pretty cool to see that. You may want to create a sort of metallic effect where you can use a couple of different grays and some whites and get really creative like you would in something like Illustrator. So it's pretty cool to see that. And all you need to do is click on add an item. And by an item, they just basically mean a color for your gradient. So when you choose that option, you can see it pulls in a default color, which we can use dynamic colors if we want to. So you could link this up to multiple different ways of creating dynamic content and dynamic values for this, using tools like advanced custom fields, pods, jet engine, and so on. So that's pretty cool to see. So let's add another color in. You can see once we choose another option, we start to see the gradient colors, even though they're both the same at the moment, come into effect. So let's just choose this green color. So what we need to do now is adjust the location, and this is basically the location or the amount of gradient that's going to be applied. So you can see the further we go up to 100, we get a much smoother gradient. The same goes then for the blue color. We can adjust that, and if we take that up, you can see we start to introduce more blue at the top half, and if that pushes further down on the gradient. You can choose between linear or radial gradient. So again, you can see you can just choose this, and we can then pick the position for the center of that radial gradient. So you may want to put that in the bottom center, for example, and you can see we can get creative use in that. So there are multiple different use cases on why you'd want to use this. Personally, I don't really use gradients that often, and if I do, they tend to be quite subtle, where I want to create some form of separation. So it could be something as simple as going from a really pale gray down to a white, just to create some visual separation that isn't in your face. So let's take a look at one of the things that I think is really useful, and that's the ability to just kind of create transformations. And these are really, really useful if you're working with more creative designs. I've created a very simple setup, and all we realistically have is a 2-column setup. And what I want to do is I want to take this right-hand column and overlap it on the left-hand side to give it some kind of visual interest. Now, you could do this easily by coming in and setting your margins and your paddings and so on to do all this kind of thing. And there's nothing inherently wrong with that. It's perfectly fine. But sometimes you just want an easier way of working. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to select this column, this right-hand column. I'm going to apply a color to it. So we're going to come over to the styles option, and from there we're going to set the background type, choose a pale blue color, and we'll just make that just a little less in your face. So we'll make it like so. And what we're also going to do is we're going to come in and we're going to add some margins around this. So we'll say 50 pixels of margin all the way around it. Actually, uncheck that, and we're going to take that off from the left hand side. We don't need anything on the left hand side. Okay, so we've now created the elements that we want. We've inset as we want to, and so on. All I need to do now is come to the power up section. We're going to come into transform, and from there we've got move. So all I need to do is select the little pencil icon, and I can now move this vertically and horizontally, and I can also do the same thing based upon the device that we're viewing it on. So you can set this up to work in any way you want when it comes to working with mobile devices and tablets. But we're going to keep it really simple. I'm just going to show you how easy it is. Now all I need to do is grab this vertical, pull that over. You can see that overlaps it, and then I can adjust, the horizontal, and then I can adjust the vertical to any value that I want. And now I've immediately created a pretty cool effect, and I've done it visually just by simply dragging some values over. Simple as that. I want to rotate it. I can do exactly that. So I can adjust the axis. So you can see I can start to rotate this on the horizontal axis, the vertical axis, or the Z axis. So if I want to give it a little bit of a quirky angle, I can do just that. However, I don't want to do that. I'm going to set those back to their default values and just undo that. Scale, well, as its name suggests, it's going to scale things. I don't think I need to really show you that. Skew, we can adjust this, skew it vertically and horizontally, so we can get quite creative in the effects that we want to achieve. So it's pretty cool. Now, even though the sliders start from a 0 value and they only go to a positive, you're not restricted to that. You can easily just drop in your own negative value to make sure you want it to go the opposite way. So don't let that put you off thinking you can't visually do that. You can just have to put those values in yourself. So super simple to do. But personally, what I like is the ability to visually create this look without the need to guess at what figures that I need for my different values. This just makes it a super easy way of working. I just like visual ways of interacting with my design. It just feels more intuitive. So that's really simple to work with. You know, you can do this in a visual fashion and do whatever you want. And then you can come back in afterwards and you can start tweaking even more. So we can take a look at one of the other options, which is the multi-layered shadow. So we can easily come in the same way as we work with the gradients, we can choose how we want this to work. We can apply it to a child element again if we want to, and we can assign exactly what CSS value we want to use inside there to target it. We can use the apply shadow on a box model or on text. So again, it's up to you whether you want to use it on the design layer, the box model itself, or you want to apply this shadow effect, multi-shadow effect to a specific text element. We've also got the ability to have different effects for both the normal and the hover state. So you could create some quite cool looking effects where you could have a flat kind of material design, and then when you hover over it, you get a slight shadow effect. You know, there's a ton of different ways in which you could use this. And all you need to do is click on add item, and this will then add in your shadow item, and you can do all the different things, but you can also select whether you want this to be positioned inside the element or outside the element. And then you can build up extra shadows, so you can just easily stack another item and another item, and you can adjust various different things, and you can build these on top of each other. So if you wanted to create, you know, multiple different kinds of cool effects with different shadow effects, you can stack them on top of each other just using this designer power up for Elementor plugin. It's pretty cool. I quite like that option. Now, I'm not going to go really any further, just to sort of say there are some extra options inside here. We've seen the transform options. We've also got a 3D perspective option inside there. Just make a note, this doesn't work if you use motion effects. And speaking of motion effects, we also have those inside here. So we've got transition effects, which we can say we want to apply a transition, and we've got the normal transitions, you know, the ease, the linear ease in, ease out, and so on and so forth. So if you want to have, you know, that animation effect as things come on, you can control that inside here. And the effects gives you the ability to do things like CSS effects. So these are the kinds of things we've probably seen when you're working with Elementor Pro itself. So nothing you probably haven't seen if you use Elementor Pro. These two plugins can really help in your day-to-day operation of Elementor, and I'd say they are both worth looking into in a little more detail. If you don't want to spend any money though, then Flexible Elementor Panels is pretty much a no-brainer in my opinion. If you want some extra productivity or design options that Designer Power Up to Elementor offers, then you can find out more information and pricing details by using the link in the description below. As always, I'd love to get your feedback on this. My name's been Paul C. This has been WPTuts. Until next time, take care.